The words, "Stepmom gave me dog food for dinner," escaped little Emma's trembling lips, sending shockwaves through everyone who heard them. No one could have predicted how this shocking revelation would spiral into a series of events that would change lives forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Rain lashed against the windows of the small cottage as Lucy sat alone at the kitchen table, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. The dim light of a single candle cast long shadows across the worn wooden surface, illuminating the bowl placed before her. Steam no longer rose from its contents. It had grown cold during the 20 minutes she'd been staring at it, unable to bring herself to take a bite. The bowl emitted a sour, metallic smell that made her stomach clench. Chunks of gray-brown matter floated in a thin, gelatinous liquid. Lucy's eyes welled with tears as she poked at it with her spoon. "I can't eat this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Evelyn turned sharply from the sink, wiping her hands on her apron. "Food is food, young lady," she said, her voice clipped with irritation. She strode over and pushed the bowl closer to the child, with chilling insistence. "There are children starving all over the world who would be grateful for what's in front of you." The little girl's shoulders hunched as she stared down at the unappetizing meal. "But it smells like—" "I don't want to hear another word," her stepmother interrupted. "You'll sit there until it's gone." With that final decree, Evelyn left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Outside, barely 50 yards from the cottage, Jonathan Albright sat in his stranded carriage, cursing his luck. The wealthy man had been returning to his mansion when the wheel had broken on the muddy country lane. His driver had gone to fetch help, leaving Jonathan to wait out the worsening storm. Rain dripped from the brim of his expensive hat as he stepped out, seeking better shelter beneath the eaves of the nearest building. The small cottage. The wind howled around him as he pressed himself against the wall, his tall figure hunched against the elements. A cracked window nearby stood slightly ajar, and through it came the sound of a child's voice, so faint he almost missed it beneath the storm's fury. "Please help me," the voice whispered. "Stepmom gave me dog food for dinner." Jonathan froze, rain soaking through his fine coat. He leaned closer to the window, uncertain if he'd heard correctly. Inside he could make out the silhouette of a small figure seated at a table, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The millionaire straightened, his face hardening with resolve. Though typically guarded and private, something about the desperate whisper cut through his carefully maintained distance from the village and its inhabitants. Without fully understanding why, Jonathan Albright found himself moving toward the cottage door, his hand raised to knock. Jonathan Albright pushed open the cottage door without knocking, his tall frame filling the doorway as rain dripped from his expensive coat. The small kitchen fell silent. Lucy's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and hope, her small hands still resting beside the questionable bowl. Evelyn froze mid-sentence, her composure momentarily shattered by the unexpected intrusion of the village's most prominent resident. "I apologize for the interruption," Jonathan said, his voice firm yet controlled. "But I couldn't ignore what I just heard." His gaze moved from the child to the bowl in front of her, then settled on Evelyn with unwavering intensity. Evelyn recovered quickly, smoothing her dress as she rose to her feet. "Mr. Albright!" What an unexpected honor. Her voice adopted the pleasant tone she reserved for public appearances. "Whatever brings you to our humble home on such a dreadful evening?" "The voice of a child in distress," he replied simply. "I was taking shelter nearby when I heard something concerning." Jonathan stepped closer to the table, examining the contents of Lucy's bowl. The unmistakable smell confirmed what he'd heard through the window. "Oh, there's been a misunderstanding." Evelyn laughed nervously, positioning herself between the millionaire and her stepdaughter. "Lucy has such an active imagination. Children say the strangest things for attention." Lucy's eyes dropped to her lap, her shoulders hunching as if trying to disappear. "Is that so?" Jonathan's expression remained unchanged. "Then you wouldn't mind explaining the contents of this bowl?" "A simple stew," Evelyn insisted, though her fingers twisted anxiously at her side. "Perhaps not to everyone's taste, but perfectly adequate." "We can't all afford the luxuries you're accustomed to, Mr. Albright." Jonathan turned his attention to Lucy. "Is that true?" he asked gently. Before the child could respond, Evelyn cut in. "Lucy is going through a difficult phase, refusing proper food, making up stories." She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder that appeared affectionate but tightened visibly. "We're working through it, aren't we, dear?" Lucy remained silent, her eyes fixed downward. "I see," Jonathan said, though his tone suggested he saw more than Evelyn would like. "Perhaps I've intruded where I'm not needed." "These matters of child-rearing can be so complex," Evelyn offered with a practiced smile. "I'm sure a man of your position wouldn't want to trouble himself with such domestic trivialities." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "On the contrary, Mrs. Harrington," she supplied quickly. "Evelyn Harrington." "Mrs. Harrington," he continued, "I find that no matter of justice is too trivial for my attention." He looked once more at Lucy, noting her thin frame and the silent plea in her eyes. "I believe we'll be seeing each other again soon." Jonathan Albright paced across the polished oak floors of his mansion, the evening's encounter weighing heavily on his mind. Rain continued to patter against the tall windows, mirroring his unsettled thoughts. The image of that small girl at the kitchen table, her frightened eyes, and the bowl of what was clearly not fit for human consumption haunted him. "You seem troubled, sir," Clara observed, entering the study with a tray of tea. The housekeeper had served him faithfully for years, her intuition about his moods nearly flawless. "I witnessed something disturbing tonight," Jonathan admitted, accepting the steaming cup. "A child, being mistreated by her stepmother." Clara set down the tray, her movements deliberate. "The little one from the village? Lucy? You know of her?" "This village holds few secrets, Mr. Albright," she replied, her voice softening. "Especially from those who listen." Jonathan moved to the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. "The woman denied everything, of course. Called the child attention-seeking." Clara's reflection appeared beside his in the window. "Sometimes the quietest whispers carry the most truth," she said. "I once fostered a child myself, years ago, a girl who barely spoke above a whisper." The millionaire turned, surprised. In all their years together, Clara had never mentioned this. "What happened?" he asked. Pain flickered across her weathered features. "I failed to hear what she wasn't saying. By the time I understood." She straightened her apron. She was gone. Back into the system. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair. "I'm hardly qualified to intervene in a family matter." "With respect, sir, you saw what you saw." Clara's tone was gentle but firm. "That child whispered her truth, and you happened to be there to hear it." The tall man moved to his desk, fingers tracing the edge of a silver frame, the only photograph he kept visible. "The last time I trusted my instincts about someone in need, I was deceived, made to look a fool. And that's kept you locked away in this mansion ever since," Clara observed. "But this isn't about your pride, sir. It's about a little girl eating dog food while we sip Earl Grey." Jonathan's jaw tightened. His housekeeper knew precisely where to aim her words. "What would you have me do? Storm into their cottage and demand custody?" he asked, frustration evident. "I'd have you remember that fairness you value so highly," Clara replied. "Start by watching, listening. The village talks, sir, and that child draws pictures that speak volumes." Jonathan nodded slowly, torn between his guarded nature and the sense of responsibility that had awakened within him. The memory of Lucy's frightened eyes challenged the walls he'd built around himself. "Very well," he finally said. "I'll make inquiries." Discreetly. Clara smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can ask, sir. Even from a millionaire." The bell above the door tinkled softly as Lucy slipped into Thomas's bakery, her small frame almost disappearing among the morning customers. The warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread enveloped her like a hug, momentarily washing away the chill that had settled in her bones from another night of fitful sleep. Thomas Baker looked up from behind the counter, his flour-dusted hands pausing mid-knead. His eyes softened when he spotted the child. "Good morning, little one," he called, gesturing her toward the back of the shop with a gentle nod. Lucy waited patiently until the last customer departed before approaching the counter. From beneath her worn coat, she produced a carefully folded piece of paper. "I made another one," she whispered, unfolding her latest drawing with trembling fingers. The baker wiped his hands on his apron and accepted the offering. The picture showed a table laden with colorful foods, roast chicken, vegetables, and a towering cake, things Lucy had likely seen but rarely tasted. In the background loomed an unmistakable structure, Jonathan Albright's mansion, its windows glowing with warm light. "This is beautiful," Thomas murmured, studying the careful lines. "You've even got the east wing just right. Have you been up to the mansion?" She shook her head. I can see it from the hill behind our cottage. Her voice dropped even lower. Sometimes I imagine what it's like inside. The baker's heart clenched. This wasn't the first drawing Lucy had shared. Over weeks he'd collected a small gallery of her work, each piece revealing the hunger that went beyond mere food. They spoke of a deeper yearning for safety, for belonging. "Wait, here," he said, disappearing into the back room. He returned moments later with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Some day-old pastries," he explained, though they both knew the treats were fresh. "They'll just go to waste otherwise." Lucy's eyes widened as she accepted the package, quickly tucking it into her coat pocket. "Thank you," she breathed. Thomas knew he was taking a risk. If Evelyn discovered his charity, she might forbid Lucy from visiting the bakery altogether. Worse still, if word spread that he was giving away food, other struggling families might expect the same treatment, something his modest establishment couldn't sustain. Yet watching the girl's shoulders straighten just slightly as she clutched her hidden treasure, he couldn't bring himself to care about the consequences. "Come back tomorrow," he said softly. "I'm thinking of putting some drawings in the shop window. Might bring in more customers." As Lucy slipped back onto the village street, Thomas pinned her latest creation to the wall behind the counter, alongside the others, a silent testament to dreams that refused to die, despite everything. Evelyn Winters stood at the center of the village square, her voice hushed but carrying just far enough for Mrs. Pembroke and the other ladies to hear. "You simply cannot imagine what I endure with that child," she sighed, adjusting her scarf with practiced precision. "Lucy creates these fantastical stories for attention, the latest being that I somehow mistreat her at mealtimes." The small gathering of women exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by this carefully crafted confession. Evelyn had been making these rounds for 3 days now, ever since Jonathan Albright had appeared at her cottage door. The millionaire's unexpected interest in her stepdaughter threatened everything she had built. "Children need discipline and structure." Mrs. Pembroke nodded sympathetically, though her eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. "Precisely," Evelyn continued. "And tomorrow I'll be donating these linens to Reverend Phillips for the church charity." She patted the basket at her feet, ensuring everyone noticed her generosity. From across the square, Margaret observed the performance with narrowed eyes. Her cousin had always been skilled at manipulation, but this latest display was particularly impressive. Watching Evelyn weave her web of half-truths made Margaret's stomach tighten with both admiration and jealousy. "She's quite the actress, isn't she?" Thomas whispered as he passed Margaret carrying a tray of fresh bread to his establishment. The baker's unexpected comment startled her. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Margaret replied stiffly, though they both knew better. Later that afternoon, Margaret lingered outside Jonathan's mansion, pretending to admire the garden while rehearsing what she might say if he appeared. The reclusive man had barely been seen in the village before, but since encountering Lucy, he'd been spotted multiple times near the cottage and bakery. "If Evelyn loses her hold on the child, perhaps I could," Margaret murmured to herself, imagining how she might position herself as a more suitable guardian. The thought of securing Jonathan's favor, and perhaps more, sent a thrill through her. His wealth could transform her life entirely. That evening at the village pub, Evelyn continued her campaign. "I've done everything for that girl since her father passed," she told the barkeeper, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Yet she repays me with these horrible accusations." A few villagers nodded sympathetically, but others exchanged skeptical glances. Lucy's quiet demeanor and thinning frame told a different story than Evelyn's polished narrative. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in the corner, sipping her drink slowly. Her cousin was fighting to maintain her reputation, but Margaret was planning something far more ambitious. If Jonathan Albright wanted to save Lucy from her stepmother, perhaps he would need someone to help him, someone like herself, who understood the village dynamics so well. She smiled into her glass. Evelyn might be the better actress, but Margaret was playing a longer game. The Easter service at the village church was a grand affair, with candles illuminating the ancient stone walls in a warm golden glow. Villagers dressed in their Sunday best filled the wooden pews, their voices rising in harmonious hymns that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Lucy sat quietly beside Evelyn, her small frame nearly disappearing in the shadow of her stepmother's elaborate Easter bonnet. Jonathan Albright had chosen to attend the service, breaking his usual pattern of solitude. The reclusive millionaire sat near the back, observing the congregation with thoughtful eyes. He noticed how Evelyn's hand gripped Lucy's shoulder with unnecessary force whenever the child shifted in her seat. As the service progressed, Lucy's face grew increasingly pale. The girl had been surviving on scraps for days, with Evelyn insisting she learn gratitude before earning proper meals. Thomas had slipped her a small pastry yesterday, but one treat couldn't compensate for weeks of deprivation. When the congregation was invited forward to receive the blessing, Lucy rose obediently, following Evelyn up the center aisle. Her steps were unsteady, her thin legs trembling beneath her faded dress. The vicar smiled kindly as she approached the altar, but Lucy couldn't focus on his face. The room began to spin, colors blurring into a dizzying whirl. She collapsed without a sound, crumpling like a paper doll onto the stone floor before the altar. For a moment, perfect silence held the church in its grip. Then came the gasps, the hurried whispers, the rustle of fabric as people rose from their seats. "The poor child!" someone exclaimed. Evelyn's performance was immediate and flawless. "My darling!" she cried, kneeling beside Lucy with theatrical concern. "She's been so delicate lately, refusing her meals despite my best efforts." Jonathan watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening. From his position, he could see what others might miss. The momentary flash of annoyance that crossed Evelyn's face before she arranged her features into a mask of maternal worry. The village doctor rushed forward, checking Lucy's pulse and lifting her eyelids gently. "Malnutrition," he murmured, too quietly for most to hear, but Jonathan caught the word and felt something cold settle in his chest. As Lucy was carried from the church, her small body limp in the doctor's arms, Jonathan remained motionless in his pew. The hymns had stopped. The Easter celebration had transformed into something else entirely, a revelation of suffering that could no longer be hidden behind Evelyn's carefully constructed facade. The millionaire's hands gripped the wooden pew until his knuckles whitened. What he had suspected from that first whispered confession through a rain-streaked window was now confirmed before the entire village. The consequences of neglect were no longer theoretical. They were embodied in a child too weak to stand before the altar on Easter morning. The amber glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across Jonathan Albright's study as Clara Henderson placed a silver tray of tea beside him. The millionaire had been unusually quiet since the Easter service, his thoughts clearly preoccupied with the small girl who had collapsed before the entire congregation. "I've never seen such neglect," Jonathan muttered, staring into the dancing flames. "That child deserves better." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she poured the steaming tea. "There was a time I could have helped someone like her," she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Jonathan turned, studying his housekeeper's face with newfound curiosity. In their 15 years together, Clara had rarely spoken of her life before entering his service. "I had a foster daughter once," she continued, smoothing her apron with practiced hands. "Amelia was her name. Much like Lucy, quiet, artistic, always watching the world with those knowing eyes." The millionaire set down his cup, giving Clara his full attention. "You never mentioned a child." "It's not something I speak of easily," the housekeeper replied, her gaze fixed on some distant memory. "Amelia was with me for 3 wonderful years. I thought we would be together forever, but her birth mother returned unexpectedly. The courts favored blood relations, and just like that, she was gone." Jonathan's usually guarded expression softened. "I'm sorry, Clara." The house felt like a tomb afterward, she confessed. Every corner held her laughter, every room an echo of what was lost. "That's why I came to work for you. This mansion was large enough to outrun my memories." Clara finally met Jonathan's eyes. "When I see Lucy, I see Amelia. That same hunger for belonging, that same quiet resilience. I couldn't help my girl then, but perhaps we could help Lucy now," Jonathan finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. The housekeeper nodded, a determined light replacing her melancholy. "If you choose to intervene, sir, you'll have my complete support. I know the village will talk. They always do. But some things matter more than gossip." Jonathan rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened village below. Evelyn has the entire community fooled with her charitable displays. "Not everyone," Clara replied. "Thomas at the bakery sees through her facade. And now, so do you." A silent understanding passed between employer and housekeeper, a bond forged from shared grief and common purpose. In that moment, their relationship shifted from the formal boundaries of master and servant to something deeper, allies in a quiet battle for a child's future. Tomorrow, Jonathan decided, turning from the window with newfound resolve. "We begin making inquiries about Lucy's situation. Discreetly, for now." Clara nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "For Lucy," she whispered. "For Lucy," he agreed. The evening fog settled over the village as Lucy Bennett crept behind Thomas's bakery, her small hands clutching a napkin filled with bread crusts she'd managed to save from her meager dinner. Despite her own hunger gnawing at her stomach, she had developed a routine of setting aside whatever scraps she could salvage from Evelyn's sparse offerings. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, stepping through the back door with a lantern raised. The light caught Lucy's startled face as she froze, mid-motion, crouched near an overturned crate where 3 scrawny cats had gathered expectantly. The baker's stern expression softened immediately. "Lucy? What are you doing out at this hour?" He approached carefully, noticing how the child protectively clutched her small bundle. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "They don't have anyone to feed them." Thomas knelt beside her, watching as she gently placed the bread crusts before the eager felines. The smallest cat, an orange tabby with a torn ear, rubbed against Lucy's ankle in gratitude. "How long have you been feeding them?" he asked, setting his lantern on the ground. "Since winter," she admitted. "They were so thin when the snow came." The baker's heart clenched. Here was this child, often going hungry herself under Evelyn's neglectful care, yet still finding compassion for creatures even more vulnerable than herself. "Wait here," Thomas said, disappearing into his shop. He returned moments later with a small sack. "Proper scraps," he explained, opening it to reveal fish trimmings and bits of meat. "Better for them than dry bread." Lucy's eyes widened with genuine delight, a rare expression on her usually solemn face. The following morning, Thomas mentioned the encounter to Mrs. Finch while she purchased her daily loaf. By afternoon, the butcher had accidentally set aside some offcuts that would only go to waste. Within days, several villagers had taken to leaving small parcels by Thomas's back door, all marked simply for the cats. Clara heard the story during her weekly visit to purchase pastries for Jonathan's household. "The child barely has enough for herself," she remarked to Thomas, her voice low. "Yet Evelyn paints her as ungrateful to anyone who'll listen." "Actions speak louder than rumors," Thomas replied, adding an extra scone to Clara's order. "Those who matter are beginning to see the truth." That evening, as Lucy made her now better provisioned rounds to the strays, she found a small jar of cream had mysteriously appeared beside the usual gathering spot. The quiet kindness brought tears to her eyes, a small acknowledgement that someone had noticed her, someone believed she mattered. Jonathan Albright sat alone in his study, rain tapping against the windows of his mansion as he sorted through a mahogany box of old papers. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. He hadn't opened this particular collection in years, finding the memories too painful to confront. His fingers brushed against a cream-colored envelope, the handwriting unmistakably Elizabeth's. His heart quickened. Jonathan carefully extracted the letter, unfolding it with trembling hands. The paper still carried the faintest trace of her perfume, a ghost of lavender that transported him instantly to happier times. "My dearest Jonathan," the letter began. He swallowed hard, hearing her voice in his mind as clearly as if she stood beside him. "If you're reading this, I'm no longer with you. I've watched you build walls around your heart since we learned we couldn't have children of our own. But, darling, those walls were never meant to be permanent." The millionaire paused, taking a steadying breath. Elizabeth had always seen through his carefully constructed defenses. "There is a child out there who needs what you can give. Not just your wealth, but your kindness, your protection, your guidance. When that child crosses your path, I beg you not to turn away. This is how your heart will heal, how our love continues." Jonathan set the letter down, moving to the window. The village lights twinkled in the distance, and somewhere among them was Lucy, small, artistic Lucy, with her quiet dignity despite everything she endured. The child had already crossed his path, just as Elizabeth had predicted. "You were always right," he whispered to the empty room. Clara knocked softly before entering with tea. She noticed the open letter immediately, and the unusual vulnerability in her employer's expression. "I've been a coward, Clara," he admitted, his imposing figure suddenly seeming smaller against the rain-streaked window. "Hiding behind propriety and caution when a child needs help." The housekeeper set down the tray. "It's never too late to do what's right, sir." Elizabeth knew. He gestured to the letter. She knew I would encounter a child who needed me, and I've been keeping Lucy at arm's length out of fear. Clara nodded, understanding the weight of this revelation. What will you do now? Jonathan straightened his shoulders, resolution hardening his features. What I should have done weeks ago. That girl deserves more than scraps and cruelty. I won't stand by any longer while Evelyn continues her abuse. The letter had broken something open in him. Not just grief, but possibility. As thunder rolled across the village, Jonathan Albright made his decision. Lucy would not face another night wondering if anyone cared enough to save her. Evelyn Blackwood paced her cottage living room, the floorboards creaking beneath her determined steps. She had noticed the way Jonathan Albright looked at Lucy during the Easter service, with concern that threatened everything she had built. The whispers around the village were growing louder, and she needed to regain control. That baker is filling her head with nonsense, she told Mrs. Patterson after church. Giving her sweets, when I've specifically mentioned Lucy's delicate constitution requires a strict diet. Her voice dripped with manufactured concern as she adjusted her hat pin. It's no wonder the child is so difficult at home. By Tuesday, Evelyn had visited 3 more households, each time dropping carefully crafted insinuations about Thomas's inappropriate interest in Lucy's welfare. I wonder what he gains from it, she mused to the vicar's wife over tea. Perhaps business from Jonathan? Men like that always have motives. She reserved special venom for Clara. Jonathan's housekeeper seems quite invested in my stepdaughter, she told Margaret during their weekly visit. I hear she lost a child once. Perhaps she's using Lucy to fill that void. Hardly healthy for anyone involved? Margaret nodded sympathetically, though her eyes gleamed with calculation. Later that afternoon she made a point of stopping by Thomas's bakery, loudly questioning the freshness of his bread within earshot of several customers. I've heard concerning things, Margaret announced to anyone who would listen, about certain establishments cutting corners. She glanced meaningfully at the baker's hands. One wonders about cleanliness. The effect was immediate. Thomas watched helplessly as regular customers began to avoid his shop. By week's end, his daily sales had dropped by half. The baker stood behind his counter, shoulders slumped, wondering how long he could keep his doors open. But on Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. Lucy had quietly placed one of her drawings in his window, a whimsical scene of villagers enjoying enormous pastries beneath rainbow-colored trees. A passing tourist stopped, charmed by the artwork, and came inside to purchase a loaf. "Did you draw that?" the woman asked Lucy, who happened to be sitting in her usual corner. When the girl nodded shyly, the visitor smiled. "It's delightful." By afternoon, 3 more visitors had entered, drawn by Lucy's art. Thomas watched in amazement as people who had avoided his shop for days suddenly returned, curious about the child artist whose work brightened his window. "Perhaps we should make this a regular arrangement," he suggested quietly to Lucy, sliding her a fresh cream bun. The girl's small smile was worth every pound he'd lost to Margaret's rumors. Across the village, Jonathan watched these developments with growing resolve. Evelyn's campaign only strengthened his determination to uncover the truth about Lucy's situation, whatever the cost. Margaret Wilson's invitation arrived at Jonathan Albright's mansion on embossed stationery, requesting his presence at what she described as an intimate gathering of the village's finest. Jonathan accepted reluctantly, his thoughts preoccupied with Lucy's situation rather than social obligations. The evening of the dinner, Margaret's cottage had been transformed. Crystal glasses caught the light of expensive candles, and the dining table groaned under silver platters of elaborate dishes. Jonathan arrived precisely on time, his tall figure commanding attention as he entered. "Jonathan, how wonderful you could join us," Margaret cooed, taking his arm and guiding him toward the other. Guests! Her perfume was overwhelming, her dress clearly chosen to impress. To his surprise, Evelyn was present, seated primly at the far end of the table. Even more unexpected was Lucy's presence, standing quietly in a corner, wearing a dress that was clearly too large for her small frame. "I thought it important the child learn proper manners," Margaret explained, noticing his gaze. Evelyn graciously agreed to bring her. Throughout the first course, Margaret dominated the conversation, repeatedly mentioning her charitable endeavors and subtly highlighting her connections to wealthy families in neighboring villages. Jonathan responded politely but remained distant, his attention drifting to Lucy, who had been seated at a small side table away from the adults. The girl ate silently, her movements careful and measured. She hadn't touched the wine glass that had been placed before her. filled with water, Jonathan noted, and kept her eyes downcast. "Lucy," Margaret called suddenly, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation. "Tell our guests about your little, drawings." The child looked up, startled. "They're just—" "Show them how you waste good paper on nonsense," Margaret interrupted, her smile never wavering. "Paper that costs good money." Jonathan watched as Lucy's cheeks flushed red. The other guests shifted uncomfortably. "I've seen Lucy's artwork," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but firm. "Thomas displays them in his bakery window. They've quite improved his business." Margaret's smile faltered. "Well, I suppose even childish scribbles have their place." "Indeed," Jonathan replied, standing abruptly, "just as kindness has its place at a dinner table." He turned to Lucy. "Would you do me the honor of showing me the garden? I hear the evening primroses are particularly beautiful this time of year." Without waiting for Margaret's permission, he extended his hand to the child. Lucy hesitated, then slipped her small fingers into his. As they stepped outside, Jonathan's resolve hardened. The calculated cruelty he'd witnessed confirmed what he'd suspected about both cousins. Lucy deserved protection, and he was increasingly certain he would be the one to provide it. Jonathan Albright stood motionless by the bakery window, his gaze fixed on the colorful drawings displayed among Thomas's pastries. One particular sketch caught his attention, an unmistakable rendering of his own mansion, with its distinctive turrets and grand entrance. The millionaire leaned closer, noting the careful attention to details he himself rarely noticed anymore. The weather vane atop the east wing, the pattern of stones around the garden path, even Clara's herb garden tucked beside the kitchen entrance. "She's quite talented," Thomas said softly, approaching from behind the counter. "Lucy comes here most afternoons. Says she likes the smell of bread." "Has she ever visited my home?" Jonathan asked, though he already knew the answer. The baker shook his head. "Not once. She draws what she imagines from glimpses through the gates. Sometimes she sits on the hill overlooking your property, just watching." Jonathan carefully lifted the drawing from the display. Among Lucy's other sketches, plates heaped with roast dinners, a table set for family meals, a bedroom with stuffed animals, his mansion stood out, rendered with particular care and affection. "May I keep this one?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "She'd be honored." Though Evelyn might not approve of the attention. Walking home, Jonathan studied the drawing more closely. Lucy had added small telling details, smoke curling from chimneys, warm light in every window, and, most revealing, tiny figures in the garden. A tall man, unmistakably himself, stood beside a small child, and a woman who could only be Clara. They were holding hands. Back at his estate, Jonathan found Clara polishing silver in the dining room. "She's never even been inside," he said, showing her the drawing. "Yet she's imagined it as a home." Clara set down her cloth, studying the picture. "Children dream of safety when they've known little of it," she said quietly. "Your mansion represents everything she lacks: protection, abundance, belonging." That evening, Jonathan noticed villagers watching him as he walked through the square. Mrs. Patterson nodded stiffly, while the blacksmith's wife whispered something to her companion. Everyone had opinions about his growing interest in Lucy's welfare. "They think I'm overstepping," he confided to Clara later. "Perhaps they're right." "Since when has Jonathan Albright concerned himself with village gossip?" she asked, her eyebrow raised. He smiled faintly. "Never before." That night, Jonathan placed Lucy's drawing on his bedside table. The child had never crossed his threshold, yet somehow she'd already made a place for herself within these walls, and within his carefully guarded heart. As rain tapped against the windows, he made a silent promise to the little artist who dreamed of his home as sanctuary. The village could whisper all they wanted. His resolve was hardening with each passing day. The village square transformed into a kaleidoscope of color and sound as the summer fair reached its peak. Wooden stalls lined the cobblestone paths, offering everything from candied apples to handcrafted trinkets. Lucy stood transfixed by a puppet show, her small frame almost disappearing among the crowd of laughing children. Evelyn Mitchell approached with measured steps, her smile fixed for the benefit of onlookers. She gripped Lucy's shoulder with fingers that dug too deep. "I've had quite enough of your behavior," she whispered, bending close to the child's ear while maintaining her public facade. "Jonathan Albright has been asking too many questions, and Thomas keeps feeding you when you don't deserve it." Lucy's eyes widened as her stepmother continued. I've written to your father's cousins in Scotland. They'll take you by month's end, far from here where you can't embarrass me anymore." The girl's face drained of color. The distant relatives Evelyn mentioned were strangers to her, cold names on Christmas cards who had never shown interest in her existence. "Please, don't send me away," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible above the fair's commotion. "It's decided," the woman replied, straightening her dress. "Now smile and stop drawing attention." When Evelyn turned momentarily to greet the vicar's wife, Lucy saw her chance. She slipped between two stalls and darted into the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fair became a blur as she pushed through layers of villagers, desperate to escape the future being forced upon her. Thomas spotted her from his bakery stall, alarm crossing his features as he noticed her panicked flight. "Lucy!" he called, but she was already gone, vanishing into the sea of fairgoers. Word spread quickly. Clara, who had been purchasing ribbons, overheard Thomas questioning a group of children about Lucy's whereabouts. The housekeeper immediately abandoned her shopping and began searching the perimeter of the fair. "The poor child has run off," an elderly woman informed her neighbor as Clara passed. "Can't blame her with that stepmother. Have you heard how she treats the girl?" Jonathan arrived at the fair just as the whispers reached fever pitch. Villagers parted before him, their curious eyes following his purposeful stride. "Evelyn threatened to send Lucy away," Clara explained breathlessly when she found him. "No one can find her." The millionaire's expression hardened. "Spread out. Check the church, the bakery, anywhere she might feel safe." As darkness began to fall, concern deepened into genuine worry. Children clutched their parents' hands more tightly, the fair's merriment now overshadowed by the search for one missing girl. "This is your doing," Evelyn hissed when she encountered Jonathan among the searchers. "Your interference has made her impossible to manage." He met her gaze without flinching. "Perhaps it's your management that's the problem." The ancient stone stairs of the bell tower creaked beneath Lucy's feet as she climbed higher, desperate to escape the chaos below. Her small hands gripped the worn wooden railing, tears blurring her vision as Evelyn's threat echoed in her mind. The summer fair continued beneath her, its cheerful sounds a stark contrast to the storm in her heart. Word spread quickly through the village that Lucy had disappeared. Jonathan Albright stood in the center of the square, his tall figure commanding attention as he organized the search. Clara's face was etched with worry as she described the last place she had seen the child. "The church," Thomas whispered, noticing a small shadow pass by the bell tower window. "I think she's gone to the church." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He strode toward the old stone building, ignoring the murmurs that followed him. The millionaire had never shown such public concern before, and curious eyes tracked his every move. Inside the church, Jonathan called Lucy's name, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. A faint sob from above confirmed Thomas's suspicion. The narrow, winding staircase to the bell tower looked treacherous, not a path someone of his stature would normally attempt. "She won't come down for me," the vicar said, wringing his hands. "The steps aren't safe." Jonathan removed his expensive coat and handed it to Clara. "I'm going up," he said simply. The gathered villagers watched in disbelief as the reclusive man began his ascent. Each step groaned dangerously under his weight. Dust and cobwebs clung to his fine clothes, but he pressed on, calling softly to Lucy. At the top, he found her curled beside the great bell, her small form shaking with fear. "They're all watching," she whispered when she saw him. "She'll be so angry." "Let them watch," Jonathan replied gently, kneeling beside her despite the grime. "No one will hurt you anymore." For several minutes he spoke quietly to the child, promises meant only for her ears. The villagers below held their breath, straining to see what was happening above. Finally, Lucy nodded and placed her hand in his. Together they began the careful descent, Jonathan protecting her with every step. When they emerged into the church nave, Lucy trembling visibly, Jonathan did something no one expected. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she buried her face against his shoulder. The assembled crowd fell silent. This was not the aloof millionaire they thought they knew. This was a man transformed by compassion, publicly embracing a frightened child without concern for his reputation. Evelyn pushed forward, her face flushed with anger, but faltered at the wall of disapproving glances that met her. The tide of public opinion had begun to turn, all because of one simple, powerful act of kindness. Evelyn's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under the weight of the village's growing suspicion. The whispers that followed her through the cobblestone streets were no longer admiring but questioning. She felt eyes on her back during her weekly shopping trips, noticed how conversations would halt when she approached the baker's counter. "I've donated more to this community than anyone," she snapped at Thomas one morning when he handed her change with noticeably less warmth than usual. The baker merely nodded, his silence more damning than any accusation. That afternoon, Evelyn made a grand show of delivering freshly baked scones to the church fundraiser, her smile stretched thin across her face. "For the Children's Fund," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Reverend Mills accepted the basket with a polite nod, but his eyes no longer held the admiration they once did. "How is young Lucy faring?" he asked quietly, and Evelyn's smile faltered for just a moment. "Perfectly well, thank you. Children can be so dramatic at that age," she replied, her voice brittle as autumn leaves. Several women nearby exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Later that week, during tea at Mrs. Pembroke's house, Evelyn's hand trembled as she lifted her cup, spilling drops onto the pristine tablecloth when someone mentioned Jonathan Albright's recent visits to the village square. "He seems quite taken with community matters these days," remarked Mrs. Pembroke innocently, "particularly concerning the welfare of certain children." "That man should mind his own business," Evelyn hissed, then immediately composed herself. "I simply mean he knows nothing of raising children." The room fell silent. It was the first crack in her perfect stepmother persona, visible to all present. Margaret, seated across the table, watched her cousin's discomfort with calculating eyes. The opportunity she had been waiting for had finally arrived. After tea, as the women gathered for evening prayers at the church, she positioned herself strategically among the most influential gossips. "Have you noticed how thin Lucy has become?" Margaret whispered, her voice dripping with false concern. "And those strange bruises on her arms last Sunday." She let the implication hang in the air, knowing the seed was planted. When Evelyn entered moments later, the group parted like water, their expressions cold. "I've always wondered," Margaret continued later, loud enough for nearby parishioners to hear, "why Lucy waits so eagerly for scraps at Thomas's bakery, almost as if proper meals are uncommon at home." By the time the evening service concluded, Evelyn's reputation had suffered irreparable damage. Her hands shook as she clutched her prayer book, watching as one by one the villagers who had once sought her approval now avoided her gaze entirely. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the village green, watching the women gather for their weekly sewing circle. For years, she had been a silent observer, keeping to herself as she fulfilled her duties at Jonathan Albright's mansion. Today would be different. "I've seen what that child endures," she said softly as she joined the circle. The women's heads turned in unison, surprised by the housekeeper's unusual boldness. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a scrap of fabric, but her voice remained steady. "Lucy has been suffering in silence for too long," she continued. "The drawings she creates, they're not just art. They're wishes for the meals she's denied." Mrs. Pembroke, the postmaster's wife, leaned forward. "But Evelyn is always so generous with the church donations. Surely she wouldn't." "Appearances," Clara interrupted, "can be carefully crafted." She set down her needlework and looked each woman in the eye. "I once had a foster daughter of my own. Amelia was her name." The circle fell silent. No one had ever heard Clara speak of a child. "She came to me broken, much like Lucy. I thought I could heal her with time and patience." Clara's voice caught. "But I was too cautious, too afraid to fight for her when the system decided she should go elsewhere. I lost her because I remained silent." Martha from the flower shop reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. "What happened to her?" "I don't know," the housekeeper admitted. "That's the wound that never heals, not knowing if she found happiness." She picked up her needle again. "But I know what happens when good people say nothing. I've seen Lucy's bowl at that cottage. I've seen how she shrinks when her stepmother enters a room." The baker's wife nodded slowly. "Thomas has mentioned the girl comes to the bakery looking half-starved." "My employer has shown more courage than I ever did," Clara said. "Jonathan may be wealthy and private, but he recognizes suffering. He climbed that bell tower for her when everyone else just watched." As the afternoon progressed, whispers spread through the circle like ripples in a pond. Women who had once repeated Evelyn's tales of an ungrateful stepdaughter now questioned the narrative. Clara felt something shift inside her, a burden lifting. For years, she had protected herself from further heartbreak by keeping her distance. Now, by standing up for Lucy, she was finally confronting her deepest fear, losing another child she had come to care for. When the women dispersed, several stopped to touch Clara's shoulder or offer quiet words of support. The housekeeper walked back to the mansion with lighter steps than she had known in years. The autumn wind rattled the windows of Jonathan Albright's study as he poured 3 cups of tea with uncharacteristically trembling hands. Clara and Thomas sat in uncomfortable silence, the baker's flour-dusted fingers contrasting with the polished mahogany of Jonathan's antique furniture. The 3 had formed an unlikely alliance over the past months, united by their concern for Lucy. "There's something you should know," Jonathan said, his tall frame seeming to diminish as he lowered himself into his chair. "This isn't the first time I've considered taking a child under my wing." Clara looked up sharply, her eyes questioning. The housekeeper had sensed there was more to her employer's hesitation than mere reluctance to get involved. "5 years ago I began adoption proceedings," he continued, staring into his teacup as if reading the leaves of his past. "A boy from an orphanage in London." Everything was proceeding well until... Thomas leaned forward. "Until what, sir?" "Until my pride got in the way." Jonathan's voice cracked slightly. "The authorities questioned whether someone as solitary as myself could provide proper care. Rather than prove them wrong, I withdrew my application entirely." Clara nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her face. "You were afraid they'd reject you." "Precisely." The millionaire rose and walked to the window, watching raindrops trace paths down the glass. "I convinced myself I was protecting the child from disappointment. But in truth, I was protecting myself." Thomas set his cup down with quiet determination. "But this is different. Lucy needs you now." "I've watched that child suffer while I debated propriety and procedure," Jonathan said, turning back to face them. "I've been paralyzed by the fear of failing her, just as I feared failing before." Clara reached across and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago. "We all carry our failures, Mr. Albright. Mine was not fighting harder when my foster daughter was taken away." The 3 sat in companionable silence, each wrestling with their own ghosts. Outside, the village continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the decision being forged within the mansion's walls. "I will not let pride stand in my way again," Jonathan finally declared, his voice finding new strength. "Lucy deserves better than what she's endured, and I have the means to provide it. Whatever the village thinks, whatever Evelyn or Margaret might say, none of it matters anymore." Thomas smiled, relief evident in his features. "Then we stand with you, sir." "The path won't be easy," Clara cautioned, though her eyes shone with approval. "The village loves its gossip." "Let them talk," Jonathan replied, his resolve hardening like steel tempered in fire. "I've hidden in this mansion long enough." The autumn air hung crisp and heavy as St. Michael's Church filled to capacity for the annual harvest prayer service. Margaret, Evelyn's cousin, had spent weeks planning this moment, her eyes constantly darting between Jonathan Albright and her increasingly vulnerable cousin. She stood now, her spine rigid with purpose, waiting for precisely the right moment. Reverend Phillips had just finished leading the congregation in prayer when Margaret rose dramatically from her pew. "I must speak," she announced, her voice carrying to the vaulted ceiling. "For the sake of a child." A collective intake of breath swept through the church as all eyes turned toward her. Lucy sat quietly beside Clara, the housekeeper's protective arm draped around her thin shoulders. "We have all heard whispers about young Lucy," Margaret continued, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "But what I witnessed in my cousin's home goes beyond neglect." Evelyn's face drained of color. "Margaret, this is hardly the time." "I saw you," Margaret interrupted, turning to face her cousin directly. "Last Tuesday, when you thought no one was watching. I saw what you served that child while you ate roast beef. I saw the dog's bowl you took it from." Gasps erupted throughout the congregation. Mrs. Winters, who had always supported Evelyn's charitable endeavors, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth in horror. "That's a lie!" Evelyn stood, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Lucy has always been difficult, always making up stories." "I found the receipts," Margaret pressed on, producing several folded papers from her purse. "Pet supply purchases, but no dog in your home." "What was it for, Evelyn?" Jonathan Albright watched silently, his tall figure imposing even seated. His eyes never left Lucy, who seemed to shrink further into Clara's embrace. "And the locked pantry," Margaret continued mercilessly. "The bruises on her arms when she reaches for bread at Thomas's bakery?" Thomas the baker nodded solemnly from his place near the back, confirming the unspoken accusation. Evelyn's desperate gaze swept the church, finding only accusation where once she'd seen admiration. "You don't understand what it's like," she hissed, her mask finally slipping completely. "That ungrateful child." "That's enough," Reverend Phillips intervened, his voice firm but gentle. "Lucy deserves our protection, not our judgment." As Evelyn fled the church, her sobs echoing against stone walls, villagers who had once praised her generosity now surrounded Lucy with whispered apologies and promises of support. Margaret watched with satisfaction as Jonathan approached Lucy, kneeling before her with quiet dignity. Her plan had worked perfectly. Evelyn was ruined, yet in her triumph she failed to notice how the millionaire's gaze never once turned her way, focused entirely on the small, brave girl who had endured so much in silence. The Autumn Harvest Festival transformed the village square into a tapestry of amber and gold, with crisp leaves dancing across cobblestones and the scent of cinnamon and apples hanging in the cool air. Villagers gathered in their finest attire, children darting between stalls adorned with colorful ribbons and overflowing baskets of produce. Lucy stood quietly at the edge of the festivities, her small fingers tracing patterns on her simple dress, eyes wide with wonder at the celebration. Evelyn appeared suddenly, her face a careful mask of maternal concern, as neighbors looked on. She gripped Lucy's arm with deceptive gentleness. "It's time to go home now," she announced loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "We've had quite enough excitement for one day, haven't we, dear?" The child's shoulders tensed visibly, her gaze dropping to the ground as the stepmother began steering her away from the festival. Several villagers exchanged uncomfortable glances, the rumors of Evelyn's treatment having spread like wildfire since Margaret's dramatic revelation at church. "Actually," came a commanding voice that cut through the festive chatter, "Lucy will be staying." Jonathan Albright stood tall amidst the crowd that parted instinctively before him. The millionaire's usually guarded expression had transformed into one of unwavering determination. Clara hovered nearby, her hands clasped tightly at her chest, while Thomas watched from his bakery stall, hope evident in his weathered face. "This is hardly your concern," Evelyn hissed, her propriety. Slipping, "She is my stepdaughter." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice carrying across the now hushed square. "I have filed formal guardianship papers with the magistrate. They were approved this morning." Gasps rippled through the gathering. The reclusive man who had once shunned the village's attention now stood firmly at its center. "You can't possibly," Evelyn sputtered, her fingers tightening around Lucy's arm. "I can and I have," Jonathan interrupted. "The evidence of neglect has been documented. The magistrate found it compelling." Lucy looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief as Jonathan extended his hand toward her. "The choice is yours, Lucy," he said, his voice softening. "You are welcome in my home, if you wish it." Without hesitation, the child slipped from Evelyn's grasp and took Jonathan's offered hand. The stepmother's face contorted with fury and embarrassment as whispers erupted around her. "You'll regret this," she threatened, but her words carried no weight as the villagers turned away from her. Their loyalties irrevocably shifted. Clara stepped forward, placing a protective arm around Lucy's shoulders as Jonathan addressed the crowd. "This child belongs with those who will care for her properly," he declared, "and I intend to ensure she never knows hunger or cruelty again." As autumn leaves continued their dance around them, Lucy's tentative smile broke through like sunshine after rain, the first true expression of hope on her face since the night a whisper in the rain had changed everything. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through autumn leaves. "He can't be serious," someone whispered as Jonathan Albright stood tall before the Harvest Festival gathering, his hand resting protectively on Lucy's small shoulder. The millionaire's voice had carried across the village square moments before, declaring his intention to become Lucy's guardian. "This is preposterous," Evelyn shrieked, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before everyone's eyes. "You have no right to take my stepdaughter." Jonathan remained unmoved, his expression resolute. "I believe the authorities will find sufficient cause when they review the evidence of your treatment," he replied, his tone measured but firm. Lucy looked up at her protector, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life free from hunger and fear. Clara stepped forward from the crowd, standing beside them in silent solidarity. The housekeeper's face glowed with quiet triumph, her own past wounds beginning to heal through this act of justice. Nearby, Thomas nodded approvingly, the baker's kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "I've prepared a room," Clara told Lucy softly, "with paints and a window that catches the morning light." A tentative smile, small but radiant, spread across Lucy's face. The expression transformed her entirely, revealing the child who had been hidden beneath layers of caution and fear. In the days that followed, the village buzzed with talk of nothing else. Margaret, having achieved her goal of unseating her cousin from her pedestal of respectability, found herself oddly hollow in victory. The social elevation she'd sought remained elusive, as Jonathan showed no interest in her schemes. The first time laughter echoed through the halls of Jonathan's mansion, Clara paused in her dusting, tears springing to her eyes. The sound, bright and uninhibited, came from the garden where Lucy was showing Jonathan her latest drawing, a colorful depiction of their unlikely family. Thomas became a regular visitor, bringing freshly baked treats that Lucy no longer had to hide or savor in secret. The cottage where she had once whispered her desperate plea stood empty now, a fading reminder of darker days. By winter, when snow blanketed the village in pristine white, Lucy's transformation was remarkable. Well-fed, properly clothed, and surrounded by genuine affection, she blossomed. Her artwork adorned the walls of the mansion and Thomas's bakery window, drawing admiration from villagers who had once turned blind eyes to her suffering. What began as a whisper in the rain, a child's desperate plea heard by chance, had become a declaration of belonging that changed not only Lucy's life, but the very fabric of the village itself. The once reclusive millionaire, the devoted housekeeper, the compassionate baker, and the resilient little girl had formed an unbreakable bond, proving that family could be found in the most unexpected circumstances.